In early May 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. Inside the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims, France, General Dwight Eisenhower stood at the center of the largest military coalition in history, overseeing what appeared to be the final administrative steps of victory. Nazi Germany was finished. Berlin had fallen. Adolf Hitler was dead. German armies across the continent were surrendering in fragments, sometimes without orders, sometimes without leadership. To most of the world, the war was effectively over. But inside Allied command rooms, a different war was quietly beginning. It was not a war of tanks or bombers. It was a war of positioning, of borders, of influence, of who would control what remained after the smoke cleared. Eisenhower understood this reality better than most. For months, his decisions had been shaped not only by defeating Germany, but by managing an alliance that was already showing signs of fracture. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were still fighting the same enemy, but they were no longer fighting for the same future. And nowhere was that tension more dangerous than in Central Europe. Austria, long annexed by Nazi Germany, had become a silent question mark on Allied maps. It was strategically valuable, politically symbolic, and geographically positioned at the fault line between East and West. Everyone knew that whoever reached key Austrian cities first would gain leverage, not just in post-war negotiations, but in shaping the balance of power for decades. Officially, Eisenhower had made his position clear. The Western Allies would halt at agreed-upon lines. The Red Army, advancing from the east, would take Vienna. There would be no race, no provocation, no misunderstanding. At least, that was the plan on paper. But wars are not ended by paper. They are ended by men on the ground, men with weapons, initiative, and sometimes dangerous independence. One of those men was General George S. Patton. Patton commanded the U.S. Third Army, a force that had ripped across France, smashed through the Siegfried Line, and driven deep into southern Germany with unmatched speed and aggression. He was brilliant, relentless, and utterly incapable of slowing down simply because someone told him to. To Patton, the war was not finished until his tanks stopped moving. And in early May 1945, they were still moving. As German resistance disintegrated, Patton's armored columns surged eastward into territory that was no longer clearly defined. Orders became ambiguous. Lines blurred. Communication lagged behind movement. And while Eisenhower focused on coordinated surrender logistics, Patton focused on what he saw in front of him: open roads, collapsing enemy formations, and strategic objectives that could be seized without a fight. One of those objectives was Austria, specifically the city of Linz. Linz was not just another town on the Danube. It sat astride major transportation routes, industrial infrastructure, and symbolic ground that both the Soviets and Western allies recognized as valuable. Intelligence reports indicated that Soviet units were advancing toward the region from the east. It was only a matter of time. But Patton did not wait. Without dramatic announcements, without grand declarations, elements of the U.S. Third Army crossed into Austria and occupied key positions ahead of the Red Army. The move was fast, decisive, and, critically, irreversible without confrontation. By the time higher headquarters fully realized what had happened, American tanks were already in place. Austria, or at least part of it, was no longer an abstract post-war question. It was occupied by Patton. News of the maneuver traveled quickly up the chain of command. When it reached Eisenhower, it landed not as a battlefield report, but as a political detonation. Patton had not merely advanced. He had altered the post-war map. From Eisenhower's perspective, the situation was explosive. The agreements with the Soviet Union were fragile, built on trust that barely existed. Any perception that the United States was deliberately blocking Soviet advances could be interpreted as betrayal, or worse, preparation for conflict. This was not a misunderstanding the alliance could afford. Eisenhower now faced a dilemma that would define the final days of the war. If he ordered Patton to withdraw, he risked losing leverage, credibility, and control over a general who did not respond well to restraint. If he allowed Patton to remain, he risked provoking Stalin at the precise moment when cooperation was still required to stabilize Europe. Either choice carried consequences far beyond Austria. Behind closed doors, senior officers debated quietly but urgently. Some argued that Patton had simply exploited battlefield reality, that the Soviets were not yet there, and territory unoccupied was fair game. Others warned that such logic ignored the political reality of alliance warfare. This was no longer about defeating Germany. Germany was defeated. This was about what came next. Eisenhower understood that Patton was not acting randomly. He knew Patton's instincts, his distrust of the Soviet Union, and his belief that the Western Allies would one day regret allowing Eastern Europe to fall behind the Iron Curtain. Patton believed the real enemy was shifting, and he was positioning accordingly. But belief did not equal authority, and authority, in this moment, rested with Eisenhower. As reports continued to arrive confirming the American presence in Austria, Eisenhower realized that silence was no longer an option. Moscow would soon notice, if it had not already. Once the Soviets reacted, the situation could escalate beyond anyone's control. The war in Europe was ending, but peace was not yet secured. And one American general had just forced the Supreme Allied Commander to confront a future that no one was ready to admit had already begun to be why the second week of May 1945. The guns across Europe were falling quiet, but inside Allied command centers the atmosphere had grown tense rather than celebratory. Victory had removed the common enemy. And without that pressure, the fractures within the alliance were becoming impossible to ignore. Reports from Austria continued to arrive at Supreme Headquarters. They were precise. American armor in control of key crossings. Third Army units securing towns along the Danube. No German resistance. No Soviet presence. On paper, nothing had gone wrong. In reality, everything had changed. Eisenhower understood the gravity of Patton's move. This was not an accidental overextension or a fog of war error. It was deliberate, calculated, and executed by a commander who believed speed created facts, and facts created leverage. The problem was that the leverage Patton had created was not purely military. It was political. The agreements between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union had defined occupation zones, but those agreements were flexible only as long as trust remained intact. Austria had been designated for joint occupation, with Vienna falling under Soviet control. Patton's presence did not technically violate the agreement, but came dangerously close. Close enough to raise questions, close enough to trigger suspicion. Eisenhower knew how Stalin thought. He had studied Soviet behavior throughout the war. He understood that Stalin interpreted movement as intention and silence as concealment. Eisenhower's dilemma and Stalin's silence. By the second week of May 1945, the guns across Europe were falling quiet, but inside Allied command centers the atmosphere had grown tense rather than celebratory. Victory had removed the common enemy. And without that pressure, the fractures within the alliance were becoming impossible to ignore. Reports from Austria continued to arrive at Supreme Headquarters. They were precise. American armor in control of key crossings. Third Army units securing towns along the Danube. No German resistance. No Soviet presence. On paper, nothing had gone wrong. In reality, everything had changed. Eisenhower understood the gravity of Patton's move. This was not an accidental overextension or a fog of war error. It was deliberate, calculated, and executed by a commander who believed speed created facts, and facts created leverage. The problem was that the leverage Patton had created was not purely military. It was political. The agreements between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union had defined occupation zones, but those agreements were flexible only as long as trust remained intact. Austria had been designated for joint occupation, with Vienna falling under Soviet control. Patton's presence did not technically violate the agreement, but it came dangerously close. Close enough to raise questions. Close enough to trigger suspicion. Eisenhower knew how Stalin thought. He had studied Soviet behavior throughout the war. He understood that Stalin interpreted movement as intention and silence as concealment. Any perception that the United States was deliberately positioning forces to deny Soviet objectives could be seen as preparation for a future confrontation. That was a risk Eisenhower could not ignore. At the same time, withdrawing Patton without resistance from the Soviets would mean surrendering ground voluntarily. ground that had been taken without bloodshed at no cost, through superior operational momentum. The question was no longer military. It was strategic. Communications with Moscow were cautious and deliberately restrained. No accusations. No justifications. Only carefully worded updates about current dispositions and temporary security operations. The Soviet response was muted. No immediate protest. No official complaint. No diplomatic explosion. To some, this silence was reassuring. To Eisenhower, it was alarming. Stalin rarely reacted impulsively. When he remained quiet, it usually meant he was calculating. The Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses during the war, but it now stood deep in Eastern Europe, unmatched in land power. Stalin did not need to shout. Time was on his side. Inside AEF, Eisenhower convened his senior commanders. The discussion was restrained, professional, but tense. Patton's name dominated the conversation, not as a hero of victory, but as a destabilizing variable. Some officers defended him. They argued that Patton had acted within his operational authority, exploiting a collapsing enemy and preventing chaos in territory that might otherwise fall into disorder. Others pointed out that the Soviet advance had not yet reached the area, and that joint occupation could still occur later. But Eisenhower saw beyond the immediate map. He was thinking about credibility, about restraint, about the message sent when generals began redrawing boundaries on their own initiative. Patton was summoned to explain his actions. The conversation between the two men was controlled, but unmistakably strained. Patton argued his case bluntly. He insisted that his advance had prevented disorder, that the Soviets were weeks away, and that yielding ground unnecessarily would only embolden future demands. Patton did not hide his distrust of Soviet intentions. He believed history would judge hesitation harshly. Eisenhower listened. Then he reminded Patton of something fundamental. This war had been fought by coalition, and coalitions survive only through discipline. Patton was ordered to halt further advances, not withdraw, not escalate, simply stop. The message was clear: no more independent positioning, no more unilateral decisions. Patton complied, outwardly, but the situation had already crossed a threshold. American troops were in Austria. Soviet commanders would soon encounter them face to face. The question was no longer whether contact would occur, but how it would unfold. When Soviet reconnaissance units finally approached the region, the encounter was tense but restrained. There were no shots fired, no flags lowered, no dramatic standoffs, just soldiers from opposing systems staring at one another across roads that had not yet decided which future they belonged to. Reports from Soviet commanders moved upward. They noted American armor, disciplined formations, firm control of territory. The information reached Stalin, and still, he did not respond publicly. Privately, however, the implications were clear. The Western Allies were not simply liberators. They were now competitors. Austria had become more than a liberated nation. It had become a test case. How much ground could be held? How much pressure could be applied? And how far could boundaries be shaped before resistance appeared? Eisenhower understood that the decisions made in these quiet weeks would echo long after the war's end. The absence of open confrontation did not mean the absence of conflict. It meant the conflict had changed form. What Patton had done forced Eisenhower to confront a truth that would define the post-war world. Military victory did not automatically produce political clarity. In some cases, it created uncertainty, and uncertainty, left unmanaged, became the seed of future wars. Austria now sat at the edge of that uncertainty, held not by treaties, but by the presence of men with rifles and orders that could shift overnight. The alliance still existed, but the trust that sustained it was thinning. And Eisenhower knew that whatever he said next, to Patton, to Stalin, to Washington, would help determine whether Europe moved toward stability or toward another, colder conflict. He did not hide his frustration. In private conversations, he made his views clear. He believed the Soviets were already preparing for domination. He believed hesitation would be remembered as weakness. He believed the war's end had arrived too soon, before the real enemy had been confronted. Those statements circulated, and in the new political climate, they were dangerous. Eisenhower did not punish Patton publicly. He didn't need to. In the emerging post-war order, relevance was power, and Patton was quietly removed from the center of it. Meanwhile, the Soviet response finally arrived, not through protest, but through positioning. Red Army units consolidated control over eastern Austria and Vienna. Boundaries were clarified. Joint occupation was formalized. No confrontation. No retreat. Just lines drawn and respected. Austria became a divided space, but not a battlefield. Unlike Germany, it would eventually regain sovereignty. That outcome was not guaranteed in May 1945, but was preserved precisely because escalation had been avoided. Eisenhower knew this, and history would later confirm it. Patton, however, would never see it that way. To him, Austria represented a missed opportunity, a moment when momentum could have shaped the future more decisively. To Eisenhower, it represented something else entirely. Proof that restraint, not speed, would define the next era of conflict. The Cold War did not begin with speeches or treaties. It began with moments like this. An advance that went too far. A commander who moved faster than politics allowed. A supreme Allied commander who chose silence over spectacle. And a sentence Eisenhower would repeat often in private. Winning the war was easier than winning the peace. Patton had won battles. Eisenhower was trying to prevent the next one that, after Austria, Patton understood something had changed. No orders came, but no trust remained either. The radios still worked. His headquarters still functioned. His troops still respected him. But the freedom that had defined his command since North Africa was gone. Every movement was now watched. Every decision questioned. Every statement reported upward. Patton had not been relieved, but he had been contained. And Patton knew it. In private conversations with his staff, his tone shifted. The fire was still there, but now it was edged with bitterness. He no longer spoke about Germany. Germany was finished. What concerned him was what came next, and who would control it. According to officers who served with him in May and June of 1945, Patton repeatedly returned to the same idea. We stopped too early. To Patton, Austria was proof. Proof that American forces could move faster, organize better, and stabilize territory more effectively than the Soviets. He believed the Red Army was not liberating Europe. It was occupying it, and every mile conceded without pressure would never be regained without blood. What disturbed him most was not Eisenhower's order to withdraw. It was the reasoning behind it. Patton believed the Allies were negotiating from fear. Fear of confrontation. Fear of headlines. Fear of breaking an alliance that already existed only on paper. He saw the future clearly in his own mind. Divided Europe, armed borders, proxy conflicts, ideological war without end. And he believed history would ask why no one acted when the opportunity still existed. Patton said openly that the Soviets understood only force and positioning. To him, diplomacy without leverage was surrender delayed by paperwork. These views were not secret, and that was the problem. In the weeks after Germany's surrender, Patton's remarks began appearing in intelligence summaries and political briefings. Some were softened. Others were quoted directly. His criticism of Soviet behavior, his dismissal of Allied restraint, his belief that the wrong enemy would dominate the peace. All of it alarmed Washington. This was not the message the United States wanted associated with victory. America was presenting itself as stabilizer, not conqueror, builder, not enforcer. The Marshall Plan had not yet been announced, but its logic already existed. The U.S. would shape the post-war world through economics and alliances, not armored columns. Patton didn't believe that would work. And worse, he said so. By late summer 1945, the decision had been made. Patton would not play a role in shaping post-war Europe. Officially, he was reassigned. Quietly, he was removed from influence. No accusations. No court-martial. No confrontation. Just distance. Eisenhower never publicly condemned him, but he never defended him either. The relationship between the two men never recovered. Mutual respect remained, but trust was gone. Eisenhower had chosen stability. Patton had chosen momentum. In the emerging Cold War world, momentum without control was unacceptable. Patton felt betrayed, not personally but strategically. In his diary, His language hardened. He wrote about mischances, about political blindness, about leaders who feared headlines more than history. He believed the war had ended with the enemy defeated, but the danger untouched. Then, in December 1945, everything stopped. Patton's car accident outside Mannheim ended his life at 60 years old. Officially, it was just that, an accident. No conspiracy. No hidden hand. History accepts this. But the timing mattered. Patton died before the Cold War began in name, but not in reality. Within 2 years, everything he warned about became policy. Containment, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, the Iron Curtain, lines drawn across Europe. The very lines Patton had tried, unsuccessfully, to push back in Austria. Eisenhower would later become president. As president, he would oversee the same Cold War Patton predicted, but now through deterrence, not maneuver. And in private reflection, Eisenhower admitted something few expected. Patton had been early. Not wrong, just early. Austria would eventually become neutral ground, one of the few places where East and West met without permanent division. That outcome was shaped in part by the tense days of May 1945, when Patton crossed a line and Eisenhower refused to let it become a war. Both men were right, and both paid a price, one with his career, one with the burden of restraint. Austria was not stolen. It was a warning, and history listened. Just too late for the man who sounded it first. What happened after Patton withdrew from Austria was never presented as a victory. There was no press conference, no declaration, no public acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred at all. Officially, American forces simply realigned to agreed occupation boundaries. Unofficially, something far more important took place. Behind closed doors, between cables, envoys, and quiet meetings, the United States and the Soviet Union reached a set of understandings that would define how post-war Europe would actually function. Not on paper, but in practice. Austria was a test case, and both sides knew it. When Eisenhower delayed Patton's withdrawal by 1 week, that delay was not indecision. It was leverage. Every hour American troops remained in Linz, every supply truck, every civil affairs office, every school reopened under U.S. supervision strengthened Washington's bargaining position. The Soviets understood this immediately. Red Army units could have pushed forward. They had the numbers. They had artillery. They had proximity. But they didn't. Because firing the first shot against American forces in May 1945 would have shattered the victory narrative Stalin needed. The war had just ended. Europe was exhausted. A clash with the United States would not look like liberation. It would look like conquest. So Moscow chose pressure over force. Diplomatic pressure. During the 6 days between May 9th and May 15th, cables moved constantly between Moscow, Washington, London, and Vienna. Soviet diplomats accused the U.S. of violating Yalta. American diplomats responded by citing temporary stabilization measures and humanitarian necessity. Both sides were lying slightly, and both sides knew it. The real negotiations weren't about Linz itself. They were about precedent. If the Americans could seize and administer territory inside a Soviet zone, even briefly, then the post-war map was not as fixed as Moscow wanted it to be. And if the Soviets forced an immediate withdrawal under threat, then Washington would appear weak in the very first test of the peace. Neither outcome was acceptable, so a compromise was shaped, quietly. The official occupation boundaries remained unchanged, but the interpretation of those boundaries did not. The Soviets agreed to delay full administrative control over certain areas, including key infrastructure zones and former concentration camps like Mauthausen. American personnel remained involved in oversight during the transition period. In return, the U.S. committed to a visible withdrawal timetable and reaffirmed public support for Allied agreements. No signatures, no headlines, just understanding. Austria would be neutral, not immediately, but eventually, and neither side would force the issue while Europe stabilized. This was not generosity. It was caution. What emerged from the Linz crisis was a rule that would shape the next 45 years. Territory mattered, but so did optics. Force mattered, but so did timing. And escalation was the ultimate failure. Patton had forced the issue. Eisenhower contained it. The diplomats codified it. The Cold War didn't begin with speeches or walls or doctrines. It began with moments like this, where both sides tested limits and pulled back just short of disaster. For the Soviets, Austria was the first indication that the United States would not automatically yield ground simply because agreements existed. For the Americans, it was proof that the Red Army would apply pressure but avoid open conflict when the risk was too high. Both lessons would be remembered in Berlin, in Korea, in Cuba, in every proxy war that followed. Patton never saw that future unfold, but his actions in May 1945 forced the first real negotiation of the post-war world, not between enemies, but between uneasy allies already preparing for rivalry. Eisenhower rarely spoke publicly about Linz, but in private correspondence years later, he acknowledged that the crisis had been a turning point. It revealed how fragile Allied unity truly was, and how quickly yesterday's partner could become tomorrow's adversary. The war had ended, but the struggle for Europe had just begun. Austria survived that struggle intact, one of the few countries not split by ideology, walls, or permanent occupation. That outcome was not inevitable. It was negotiated, and it began when one general crossed a line he wasn't supposed to cross, and another general chose not to crush him for it. History would remember the Cold War as a clash of systems, but its first sparks came from personalities, from Patton's defiance, from Eisenhower's restraint, from a city called Linz that became the rehearsal stage for a divided world. And that is why this story still matters, because it shows how close history came, not to war, but to a very different peace.